Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I see people are slowly coming in. So we'll start in about 1 minute so I can introduce our moderator. Okay, well, let's begin. It's so wonderful to see so many people joining us here today. My name is Bora Lachi, and I'm the Assistant Director of Programs and Director of Studies at the Tower Center. Before we begin, I would like to go over some guidelines. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. And if you have any comments, please use the chat function. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon. Many of y'all know him, Dr. Jim Hollifield. He's the Director of the Tower Center for Public Policy, International Affairs, and also a professor here at SMU. And he has the honor to introduce our distinguished speaker today. So, Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Bora. And welcome to everyone for this beautiful fall-like day here in Dallas. And it's my privilege to welcome back to the Tower Center and back to SMU, Dr. Constanze Stelzenmüller. I think she has fond memories of being here a number of years ago, but she is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. We agreed that she doesn't need a very elaborate introduction because everyone here, I think, on this call knows who she is and reads her columns in the Financial Times and elsewhere. She is, as you know, one of the leading authorities on US-Europe relations with a particular focus on Germany. And she's going to talk to us today about why the United States needs Europe, really. So, Constanze Stelzenmüller, welcome.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Jim. It's lovely to be back in Dallas, although I have to say I really resent the fact that I can only do it virtually. That bums me out, as they say in your culture. I have very fond memories of my visit. Texas hospitality is legendary, of course. And I think I also remember some steaks. Anyway, such is life. I'm going to have to do it here from my table in Washington, D.C., where also we have beautiful fall weather. So you've asked me to talk about the future of transatlantic relations. And I'm conscious that your listeners may have a ton of questions. So I'm going to try and keep this short and snappy. And I want to cover three things. I want to cover the impact of the pandemic on geopolitics first. Then I want to talk about the US elections on November 3rd and their impact on transatlantic relations. And then I want to talk about the European and the German side of this. And I suspect that I am going to have to sort of, for the sake of brevity, just sort of basically make some boom, boom, boom claims, which some of you may take issue with or not. I hope that we can discuss them in Q&A. Certainly nothing that I intend to say is intended to be in any way, presumptuous or assuming that such remarks don't require explanations. But obviously, this is not the kind of talk where you can elaborately footnote yourself. So with that preface, let me start with the pandemic and its impact on geopolitics, because I think that is a really necessary preface to any conversation that we have today about transatlantic relations. And it's the following. I think it was Larry Summers who said that this is the third global shock we've seen in the 21st century. The first one was 9/11. The second one was the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, which, as we know, morphed into a Eurozone crisis within Europe, and now the pandemic. And I want to say to you that the pandemic is a stress test for all of the systems that we live in. Society, markets, the nation state, Europe, transatlantic relations, and the international community and its institutions. And I think it's also a crisis of humanity whose extent and end we are far from being able to guess. If anything, we are maybe at the end of the beginning. But this ain't over yet. And I think it also won't be over when a vaccine is found. I think it may, we may be dealing with the crisis itself and its aftermath for years, in fact. So that, I think, is an important caveat to what we're discussing today. I don't think that the pandemic has a completely transformative impact on our geopolitical strategic environment. I don't think it will end globalization as we know it or international order, but what it does do is shine a bright and unsparing light on the divides and flaws that are there. And those are flaws and divides within the global order, and I would add within America and within Europe and Europe's nations, including my own Germany. Now, for all of those of you who are students of international relations, we've become accustomed to saying that in the pre-pandemic era that the agreed geopolitical paradigm for describing the current world order is the replacement of a more or less cooperative and rule-based international order by an increasingly virulent great power competition. There are camps, both in America and in Europe, who say that the only actor, the only international actor, the only state that can be strong and successful in this context is one that can assert its national sovereignty, and if necessary, by decoupling from globalization as much as possible. And before the beginning of the pandemic, we saw, all of us, I think, Americans and Europeans alike, that this seemed to be turning into a bipolar contest of power between the US and America, certainly taken by the horns, forced by the Trump administration, but equally certainly, caused by a highly aggressive global Chinese strategy of dominance with the purpose of ending the age of American exceptionalism and perhaps beginning an era of Chinese exceptionalism. And very often this thesis was also discussed in the context of the supposition that this was the end of the West and the ultimate proof of the rise of illiberal powers. And it seems to me that the COVID-19 pandemic should cause us to add a couple of corrections to this image. I think the obvious edit is that viruses don't respect borders. They're not terribly interested in national sovereignty, but it clearly requires a cross-border cooperation to fight them and to try to deal with their consequences. So it seems to me that the pandemic has given us another argument for recognizing that global integration with good sides and bad sides exists, and that we need international cooperation to do something about these bad sides. I say this because both in America and Europe, there has been a tendency, particularly by the national sovereigntists, to suggest that globalization is a false belief, which is why many in those camps call it globalism. In other words, it's a false consciousness, as the Marxists used to say. And I would say, it seems to me that you can certainly make a religion out of the. I accept the critique of a sort of too rosy reading of globalization and its consequences, but I think it was a mistake to suggest that it was just a mental attitude. My second lesson from the pandemic is that, and this is here I'm quoting Frank Fukuyama, a piece that he wrote recently in, I believe, The Atlantic, that the pandemic has shown us that two characteristics are decisive for a country and a state, a nation state, to come through the pandemic more or less unscathed. And that is functioning governance and the earned trust of its citizens. And it also seems to me that if you say that's been the key criterion for coming through this pandemic, sort of, then actually the two great illiberal powers, Russia and China, haven't really had that great a time. I think that we've seen in the context of the contestations in Belarus, but also with demonstrations in Siberia and elsewhere, that the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, appears to be somewhat on the defensive. And while the Chinese have seen their productivity surge again, I think that this current geopolitical moment has, on the whole and on balance, been extremely bad for Beijing. That Chinese secrecy and denial and hypocrisy on the way they dealt with the outbreak in Wuhan has been extremely damaging to Chinese efforts to insert themselves as responsible stakeholders globally. And while I think I hope you'll forgive my saying this and with such clarity, I think it's pointless and in fact damaging to suggest that the coronavirus is a Chinese problem created by China or even weaponized by China, calling it the Wuhan virus and things like that. Clearly, the way the Chinese have managed this has been terrible. And their so-called wolf diplomacy in Europe and elsewhere has not exactly helped their case. So my proposition is that both Russia and China come out of this crisis diminished. But I will add, and here many of you may disagree with me, and I hope you will not take this personally or be offended by it. I would say that the case of the United States of America shows us that a 200-year-old democracy is not immune to the issues of governance and societal political trust that such a pandemic exposes. I am personally very critical of the pandemic management of this administration. But I think that I wouldn't lay the blame only at the door of the administration. It seems to me, as a decade-long student of American governance and politics, that the pandemic has also shone a somewhat unforgiving light on genuine structural issues in America. Issues of inequality, of lack of access to resources of education, access to markets, access to voting rights. And I think the thing that we learned from this is that democracies, even old and deeply rooted democracies, are not self-repairing. They need to be taken care of. They need to be cherished. And I don't want any of you to think that I don't see similar issues in Europe. I do, and I can talk about those at great lengths. But my point is that this moment and the crisis management of this administration, I think, has also done great damage to something that Europeans have for decades after 1945 relied on, which is American leadership in world affairs, which has always been based on three pillars: America's democratic domestic order, its willingness to protect global public goods, and its readiness to put itself to lead global efforts of crisis management. On all of these points, I think the Trump administration has been lacking. That brings me to the elections and their meaning for transatlantic relations. I was joking with Jim just now that Washington is boring and same old, same old. Obviously, I meant the opposite. I've lived in this country I'm living here for the third time in my life. My dad, a German diplomat, was posted here when I was a little girl. For 4 years, I went to graduate school at Harvard for 3 years in the late 80s, and I've been living here since 2014. And I think I have seen a couple of times in American political life where there were tangible, even for a child, tangible societal and political tensions that seem to threaten to split the nation. But I think that this situation is truly exceptional, and that we are living through a multi-crisis of health, the American economy, the American political system, and yes, I think to some degree a constitutional crisis, because I think I see, and again, you may disagree with me, and I hope you will not find this point disrespectful. I think this is the first president in history who has questioned some of the fundamental tenets of the American constitutional order in this way. I wrote my German doctoral thesis on American constitutional law. I have something approaching to reverence for the American Constitution and its history. And some of the teachers that taught me at Harvard are no longer alive, but I think I have an idea of what they might be saying now. Now, what this means is that it seems for me, it's really hard to do the kind of sort of punditry that somebody like me would ordinarily be doing about the foreign and security policy perceptions, attitudes to alliances, attitudes to international order, when the capital of the superpower is in such disarray. With the images that we saw on the weekend and on the morning of the return of a president to the White House, where an increasing number of his key staffers are ill. But I'll try to do it anyway. And that is that I think a second Trump term and what it would look like is no longer a mystery to us. We know that it would be more of the same, except more so. In other words, it would be an America First line framed in a sort of ethno-nationalist culture war articulation of America's national interest, but with less control and containment by the institutions of the balance and separation of power. I think loyalists and family members would have a greater role even than they have now. And I think the personnel of the power bureaucracies would continue to dwindle as it has been doing for the last 2 or 3 years. I think that the self-radicalization of the Republican Party would continue. I think that somebody like John Boehner, who shocked Washington politics and shocked European interlocutors when he first came on the scene in the context of the Freedom Caucus, now seems like a decent, approachable, and considerate man. I've met him on panels and moderated him, and I think that some of the folks inhabiting Washington politics now make him look like a traditional Republican moderate. And that's a real issue. And that is, again, not to say that there aren't issues on the other side of the political aisle. I am trying here to give you an unvarnished sense of what the perceptions in Europe are. The other thing that I would worry about with the Trump administration is that the current crisis, because it appears to be so unmanaged, is depleting the power resources of this country, and would make it very difficult ultimately. And I think that would become visibly in a second Trump term, that would become very visible, that the threats the president likes to issue, the bluffs that the president likes to use, would be called by America's adversaries and challengers more often. And there is a genuine risk that they would be perceived as not being substantiated by power resources that the administration can deploy. Let me move to the other side, the other option here, President Joe Biden. I have no intention of glamorizing this option. I think that given the age and the personal experiences of this president, he is likely in many ways to be a transitional figure if he becomes president. But I would say that it's not just Europeans, but other allies worldwide. And I think many practitioners and civil servants in Washington, and I think many in Congress and the Senate, who would appreciate that he and his most important advisors made their sort of key experiences in their political lives in a time when America's exceptional status, its leadership role, and what they would call its responsibility were taken as granted. And I think there would be an assumption among allies, including in Europe, including in Germany, that they would be treated that they would be less singled out, that alliances would be treated less transactionally, and that allies and leaders in Europe and elsewhere would be treated with greater personal respect. The challenge for a Biden administration, however, would be that the world really has changed in ways that this group may have to yet learn to deal with. And it didn't start to change because of Trump or in 2016. And those are changes that I think we would all together then have to discuss and negotiate. But there would, I think, unlike with the Trump administration, there would, I think, be a genuine discussion and I hope an expectation of cooperation. I would caution, though, that even a Biden administration would have two issues which would limit its foreign and security policy bandwidth. And that is a continued opposition from the other side of the aisle, which I think in its intensity and the radical nature of its positions would make the Freedom Caucus and the Tea Party of a decade ago, 15 years ago, look like Sunday morning softball practice. And I also think that the damage, the structural divisions and the damage that the pandemic has wrought in this country would also have to be the first priority of a President Biden. And those two things would greatly limit the bandwidth that this administration might have for foreign and security policy, which is a concern for Europe. So let me answer, one final point. I think a Biden administration would also have to consider very carefully two things. And that sort of brings me to the question why America needs Europe. I think a Biden administration would have to consider how to, rather than pursuing a America first no matter what policy, how to calibrate a very delicate and complex balance between competition and cooperation in this new world that we find ourselves in. And that would be true not just with American adversaries or challengers like Russia and China, but also with those countries where a Biden administration would hope for the greatest commonalities, democracies, Western-style democracies, and in particular, above all, the Europeans. Because we too have competing views on trade and on, shall we say, technology and regulation or taxation. And that brings me to my last point, the question of why America would need us, and what we're willing to do for it. I think that it's obvious, the implied question, why does Europe need America, is very obvious. The geopolitical landscape that I have described, both great power competition and the sort of adjustments wrought by the pandemic, all add up to a maximum, a Category 5 hurricane for Europe. It matters for us whether we have America on our side and whether it's a benevolent America or a ruthless America, even if there is no specter of major war or even a medium-sized or minor territorial war within our borders or beyond them. Having America at our side as a friend as a partner will never be something that we don't need. The more interesting question is why you would need us. And here's what I would say. I'll try to make this brief since I don't want to run over time. I think that in the geopolitical climate change that I have described, all nations have become absolutely and relatively weakened. And that decoupling from each other or from world trade is essentially a chimera. Yes, America is, and China or Russia are to some degree better situated than Europe to decouple somewhat because they have large territory, strategic resources, and can close off some of their borders. These are things, all of these things Europe cannot do. We are much more exposed to the storms of globalization than any of the other three. But I think it's an illusion, and a dangerous illusion, to suggest that America can completely insulate itself against the rest of the world. The ethno-nationalist faction in this country seems to think America is an island. It's not. It is in many ways dependent not just on the decent opinion on mankind, but on data flows, on immigration, on trade inflows. And I think that gives America a strategic interest in making sure there is a benevolent order which permits the beneficial effects of these inflows to benefit America and allows it to mitigate those that are less beneficial in a format of international cooperation. Pandemic management and climate change being at the top of, I think, anyone's list. But what can we Europeans actually contribute to that? I think that in a world where we're all relatively weaker and where the ability to manage situations is more important or more realistic than shutting something out. And where, if that's true, then our domestic resilience becomes immeasurably more important than it used to be, then Europeans really have something to offer. Particularly if you have adversaries that are as determined and as aggressive as the Chinese are, or as the Russians are, in different ways. Then it matters to you for the pursuits of your national interests that Europe be not split, divided, and hollowed out by adversaries that are operating within the European theater. Because even if you didn't consider us our partners, you still have bases here that America uses, or bases in Europe, I'm here in Washington, you have bases in Europe that you use for not just to protect Europe or NATO, but for the pursuit of US sovereign national interests in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Afghanistan. If that ability to project power from European territory becomes compromised, I put it to you that that's a problem for America. But I think we have other power assets that are also of great importance to an age of great power competition under conditions of intensified interdependence. And that is our trade power and our regulatory power. Now, these are fields where there is competition between us, and there are real conflicts between us, and there are good reasons for those on both sides. But I think that it is in your interest and in our interest for us to work together to resolve them, or at least to manage them, because otherwise we will both suffer and others will profit. China above all. Now, the last point I want to make is that I'm a member of two discussion groups between Americans and Germans and other Europeans about what Europeans ought to do to bear a larger part of their own burden. And I just spent this morning between 7 and 9 on the one, and I'm going to be spending the rest of the evening writing a piece for the other group. And I can assure you that there is an intense consciousness in the strategic community, if it deserves that name, in Germany and elsewhere, that there is room for improvement on our side of the bargain, and that is in our own considered self-interest. I would also put it to you that a lot more has been happening in that space in terms of real policy changes than, say, this White House is willing to acknowledge. I think that the State Department and the Pentagon might have a much more precise and I think more benevolent sense of this. But I will end with this thought. I think that this is no time to see each other in the worst possible light. This is literally the most critical situation of our lifetimes. And I don't want to be part of a generation that when it leaves the political scene has to look itself in the mirror and say, I left those who are coming after me a world that is much less safe and much more dangerous and much more unkind, both in its domestic orders and its international order. If there has ever been a time for us to get together and to try to resolve our problems together, it's now. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll take your questions. I'm sure there are many.
Well, thank you, Constanza. And I think the plan is for me to engage you a little bit here up front with a few of my own questions to sort of get the ball rolling in terms of this discussion. And, you know, I was thinking about 3 dimensions of the U.S.-Europe relationship, and I'd like to hear you expand a little bit more on those. I was going to start with the economic dimension of our relationship, which I think is extraordinarily important, and most Americans don't understand how much we depend on each other in terms of trade and investment. But I have to go right straight to the security dimension of this relationship. You know, I was trying to imagine having this conversation 20, 30 years ago, and you never once mentioned NATO in your remarks. You know, there wasn't much about the important security dimension. You did allude to the fact that Europe still depends very heavily on the United States to guarantee its security. But I think it was the French president, Emmanuel Macron, that said NATO is brain dead. That it doesn't really.
You won't hear that from me. Don't worry.
Well, could you tell us a little bit more about the security?
Yeah, absolutely. The reason I talk so much about trade and technology is that I think that we undervalue these at our peril, and that I'm sort of at this point assume that people know. You know, I just take the NATO part as a given. Here's the deal. I think that Russia's behavior since the Georgia War 2008 has proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the importance of the military arm of the Transatlantic Alliance for territorial defense of Europe remains as relevant as ever. There can be no question about that. And I think that there has been, because of Russian behavior, and not least interestingly, because of the poisoning of Navalny and the protests in Belarus, in recent weeks, an increasing public consciousness in my own country that this is the case. I watch this space very, very closely. I think I can say I hear the grass grow in this one. And I can tell you that German officials were profoundly concerned by the Russo-Georgian War, despite the fact that Saakashvili was considered an unreliable actor in Berlin. But they were very angry at the Russians. They were horrified by the annexation of Crimea and the still ongoing proxy war in Ukraine, which has claimed more than 10,000 dead Ukrainians. And untold, because secret, numbers of Russian dead. And that I think has hardened German positions towards Russia considerably. And the fact, you know, I mean, I have three more things to name in this context. You will be asking me about Nord Stream 2, of course, and I will say something about that. But the fact is that the Germans have been doing something that everybody told me was never going to happen when I arrived here in Washington in October 2014, which they have been continuously and at some economic cost to themselves holding together the sanctions consensus in Europe on Russia sanctions. And if anything, those sanctions now risk being intensified. And we're now finally, having overcome Cypriot objections, are also seeing sanctions against the Belarusian leadership. The Russian military secret service, the GRU, hacked the German federal legislature in 2015. It took us all of nearly 5 years to say publicly that it was the GRU. A GRU operative killed a Chechen fighter and political refugee in Berlin in a public park in broad daylight last year. That took us 6 months to say publicly, to attribute that to the GRU. And the Navalny poisoning, unlike our reaction to the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury 4 years early, was immediately attributed by the defense minister, the foreign minister, and the chancellor herself to Russian official institutions. I think that tells you something about the German take on this, and why, and that at the very least is why we see the existence of NATO, its functionality, as crucial for us. And yes, we have not done what we should have done on our defense commitments. Guilty as charged. But if you look at the growth rates, if you look at the investment rates, those are actually considerable.
Could I jump in and just,
the problem is that you would be asking the German government to exercise eminent domain to the tune of about 10 to 12 billion euros. And I think the preferable policy option here, frankly, is to not do that and to ruthlessly and fiercely apply European law to the project, which I think would resolve some of the issues, if not all of them. I mean, I have additional policy prescriptions, but that's my answer on NATO. Well, but anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, I've got a few questions on the table, but
go for it.
And one of my other questions actually aligns very well with a question by my colleague Hiroki Takeuchi, and it concerns the old canard that was used by Henry Kissinger. You know, someone says we need to speak with Europe, but what number do I call? So my question is are Germany and France ready to provide more leadership in Europe? Is the EU solid enough, given its current problems, that it could step up if American power, American leadership continues to recede? And I know you've written a lot about this, you know. Is Germany, the Europeans, the French ready to step up and provide the leadership that's needed in Europe?
Sure. Look, I'm the last person to gloss over the very real cultural, political, economic divisions that there are in Europe, and Germany's role in exacerbating them. Austerity policies and pressure on the Greeks, etc., etc. I could go on at length, I won't. But I think it's important to take note of one of probably the most significant event of this year in Europe, which is the agreement on the European Recovery Package. As a sign of recognition by all Europeans, including the famous Frugal Four, that the alternative to the European project is, I think, the end of peace in Europe. I will put it that brutally. particularly at a time when the Trump administration has been practicing the kind of transactionalism, bullying, and singling out policies that it has towards Europeans, and yes, indeed, towards the German government. Those may, in some ways, I think, have reinforced a European sense that we need to do more for ourselves. Now, there are real policy disagreements between Paris and Berlin, which are shared by other countries in Europe. And this is, honestly, it is not so different between, you know, a discussion that you might have between Dallas and Delaware on what's good for the nation. These are in an economic and political space that is host to so many different political cultures, nation states with languages, economies, cultural traditions of their own. I mean, I find it a miracle that we are as united as we are. And while it's painful for an American president or an American administration to come to a European summit and to see all this play out, I grant you, the reality is that we have actually achieved quite a lot. I think that there are some very serious issues. And the two I would name is the illiberal redesign of the democratic space in Hungary and to some degree Poland, against, I think, increasing resistance from not just Polish civil society, but also Hungarian civil society, interestingly. And the ongoing war between, conflict between the two NATO members, Greece and Turkey, in which France is overtly taking the side of Greece, and the Germans are trying to mediate. This would go better with American leadership in NATO, I can assure you. And that's a real issue, not just for us, but for you. I think that there is a great deal of explosive potential in terms of competing energy, claims to energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. That is a concern not just for the Eastern Europeans, but for Israel and America. And that we are well advised to try and resolve together. And the fact that I think that Erdogan the Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, like Putin, is not in the best position, and in fact is being aggressive because he is in the defensive, doesn't make this any less dangerous. So I think that while you may be seeing a little bit of political sort of, you know, coalitions of the willing in Europe depending on the issues, I think what the last decade and this year has also shown is the extraordinary resilience of European unity despite the things that divide us.
You said you lived many times in your life in this country. You are a European. But because of your deep knowledge of the U.S. in particular, why is it, do you think, Americans have such a jaundiced view, or many Americans, a jaundiced view of Europe, of the EU? And of course, we haven't even brought perfidious Albion into this discussion yet.
Happy to do that. Look, I'm going to be brutally honest here and say that some of this, and the same thing goes for anti-Americanism in Germany and Europe, is just a lack of knowledge or projection. The people that I know in the State Department or in DOD, including in the US military, who have, you know, foreign service officers, and these people know a lot about how Europe works. And their view of Europe's assets and demerits is much more nuanced than you will often get. And so I think anti-Europeanism, as far as I'm concerned, is just as lazy and sort of unproductive as anti-Americanism is in Europe. I find both of them extremely tedious. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think, you know, it's a waste of time to engage on these things. I make the effort to have a nuanced understanding of how American politics works. And I think that American Europeanists, whether military or in the civil service or in politics, do the same thing. But it's also true that you have to renew these networks and this understanding and experience for every new generation. And that one of the things that we were really good at with each other during the Cold War and in the past 30 years was making sure that these networks didn't dry on the vine. And right now I see a real risk of that happening because we don't, we stop doing this and we make presumptions and then we get it wrong, frankly.
But isn't it still in America's interest to have a united Europe?
Well, again, it depends on what you mean by united. I would say it's in America's interest to have a cohesive Europe, a Europe that wants to and tries to speak with one voice. But remember that we're still all, 26, 27, depending on where you see the Brits, nation states I think the thing to understand here is that we're really not that different from America. I mean, yes, this country has a common constitution, but given how assertive America's states have been throughout America's history, some of you, and I wouldn't exclude Texas here, do behave like nation states, right? And do behave as though you had your own diplomacy and your own foreign and security policy. And increasingly with globalization, it's possible to do that. And one of the ironies of states' rights is that with the Trump administration's policies, we're now seeing some states, and I think even local governments, even in Texas, saying, folks, if you want to shred the EPA back in Washington, we have real climate issues here, and we're going to do something about those. I think I saw an interview with a Texan mayor who said, "Of course, I'm sticking to the Paris commitments." And so, that complicates things, but it also shows you that it's not that simple. So you're not going to get a United States of Europe in my lifetime, I don't think. But what you have is, if you are willing and able to see it, a very, very powerful ally in ways that ought to really matter to America.
Well,
I'm sure you have more questions.
There are some other questions on the table here, and my colleague Sandy Thatcher here asked a question about global order, and he's really worried that if we see the U.S. really defecting in terms of leadership, at what point, are we going to return to something like great power politics? With the rules-based international order simply collapsing of its own weight.
Well, I think there are definitely signs of that already, and I think that we have, all of us, sort of let in the international order and its institutions to sort of wither, and in some ways, I think the fact that the Chinese appear to have an inordinate influence on the World Health Organization, or the dysfunctionality of the World Trade Organization is also to be laid at our door, and that it's some of the responsibility is on us for having failed to make sure that that these institutions are functional, legitimate, and aren't subject to capture by one national special interest. But I think we may have just also been complacent and assumed that, our way is the right way and it's the highway and everybody will want to follow us. And I think it no longer quite works that way.
Well, there's another question on the table here about how is Europe reacting? I guess Europe is probably too big of a word. You could narrow it down to Germany, to this political instability in the United States, and specifically with respect to the elections. If things go badly off the rails, how is Europe going to respond to this?
Well, some of you will have seen the news reports. I mean, American media have gone around Europe or asked foreign correspondents here in Washington how they see this. I would say, and people have used words like pity or concern. I would say that I don't want to use those words, although I'm definitely worried. I think that we need to realize that the weaknesses of old established democracies are weaknesses that may befall us all. And that the worst thing we could do in this moment is to be complacent or to assume that what happens in one place can't happen in the other. I mean, just to speak to my own country, the Alternative for Germany started out as a mildly Eurosceptic party in 2013, and is now a virulently ethno-nationalist, xenophobic, hardline radical party that is plateauing in the polls because it has so visibly allied itself with right-wing extremist groupings and movements in the country. Now, I personally still find that deeply shocking and offensive. I also, even if I suspect they are going to be plateauing in that corner of German politics, A, they're not going to go away, and B, they express fears, animosities, and anger that I think one needs to take seriously. And thirdly, the AfD has changed the nature of public discourse. Fourthly, D, the AfD seems shambolic and disunited on a national level, but it has been extremely assiduous, hardworking, and effective, where it has attempted to undermine the institutions of representative democracy or mediating institutions like publicly funded media. They spend a lot of time, together with the law firms that they employ, in bringing cases before the courts, or in immobilizing the civil service with parliamentary requests for information that will, occupy whole departments for weeks on end. This is highly deliberate, and it's intentionally destructive. So, I'm not suggesting that any of the sort of the issues that I see here don't exist in Europe. They do, and what I said earlier about the pandemic means that the jury is not yet out on their ultimate success in changing the power dynamics and the constitutional orders that they so desperately want to change.
Yeah, the U.S. is clearly, we're approaching something of a watershed moment. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. This election is going to be one of the most critical elections in American history. But Europe itself, is also facing a lot of dilemmas, a lot of problems. And I want to come back before we run out of time to get you to talk more about German and European politics. If you look at Angela Merkel's inbox right now,
right.
Obviously everybody's concerned about the U.S. election. No one can be certain what the outcome will be and how that will affect U.S.-European relations. But Brexit has to be at the top of Merkel's inbox right now. I mean,
Yes.
Germany has the presidency of the EU. You have lost one of the largest, most powerful countries in Europe has decided to leave. So, and in German politics, the liberal center, if you want to call it that, which is both Christian democratic and social democratic, it looks increasingly besieged, to me anyway. So, so Europe itself and Germany are at some big crossroads here. And, how is Merkel going to manage this, being a lame duck chancellor?
Well, I think I would contest the word lame duck. That's what we thought before the pandemic. And the pandemic and the European crisis have actually returned her to a position of power and poll rates that are exceptional in German post-war history. It's extremely unusual for a German chancellor in her fourth term, in the last year of her fourth term, to have such a position of influence, not just on the national level, but on the European level. And even, I would dare say, the international level. And that is, I think, due to her leadership style, her experience, and her general sort of, rational attitude to facts. And the fact that she's good at building bridges. I mean, I definitely have critiques of her to make. And I'm writing a piece for Foreign Affairs that will contain some of those. But But that is, I think the lame duck adjective is currently not correct.
Mm-hmm.
The other issue here is that one of the things that she's failed at quite egregiously was to set in motion her own succession. Which she tried to do with the selection of Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the defense minister, as party head, and who stepped down in February after having made some serious mistakes, but also been sniped at by everybody else. And the three guys who are running right now are none of them persuasive. And so the risk that I see for the election in the fall of 2021, the date hasn't been set yet, but it has to be sometime in September or October. The risk that I see is a candidate who is, we are told, going to be chosen at the party meeting in Congress in December, a candidate who does not benefit from Merkel's poll bonus that she enjoys right now, a Green Party that is popular but doesn't pull up quite to the CDU, and a fragmented political landscape in which the AfD remains as a highly malignant spoiler. And I don't think that I don't want that as a German citizen, but I don't think that will be good for Europe either. And yes, because you ask about Brexit, the Germans, I think, are particularly concerned, were on day one. I remember I was in Berlin on the day that happened. And I remember in the sort of inner city of Berlin, which is, parts of which are kind of like Capitol Hill in Washington, people standing on street corners discussing the Brexit referendum. I mean, I woke up to the news and I confess to you that I cried. And I ran into people that I knew from the ministries who were standing on street corners discussing this. People were horrified. And I think very little has happened, particularly neither under the tenure of Theresa May or Boris Johnson, to give people a better an impression that the Brits are handling this with competence and a genuinely strategic plan. There is a great deal in the management both of the pandemic and of Brexit that people are seeing that is very, very far removed from what I have always experienced as the truly stellar competence of British government officials. There is I have to put it brutally, there is a real competence gap between British politics and British administration. And we're seeing it in effect right now. Nobody that I know, and I think I'm fairly well attuned to this debate, nobody that I know, at least in Berlin, wants to pull the Brits over the table. But they also don't get to divorce us and then say, and oh, by the way, we're taking the bank account and you're also going to have to get a facelift. That is not how this works.
Well, we've got about 2 minutes left, and I've got a couple of very specific questions on the table here. Maybe you can answer them in 2 minutes.
Sure, go for it.
One questioner, Elena Wen-Rostro from the World Affairs Council, wanted to know if it was true that Germany was not told about the drawback of the 12,000 troops, the decision to withdraw 12,000 troops from NATO.
I think we were informed ex post facto, and I can also tell you that I have been on think tank briefing rounds at DoD where it seemed that there were distinct sort of gaps in information between the National Security Council and DoD. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so. And
also, I will just say the 12,000 troops, I think, are damaging to American interests as well as ours. I think that that's a theatrical gesture and not something that is genuinely thought out.
Another question very quickly is, what's going to happen between Greece and Turkey? Is Germany going to be able, or is Europe going to be able to mediate this conflict?
This is incredibly hard to predict. I mean, Erdogan, I think the problem with the Russians and with Erdogan is that they're really bad at reading the room. They're really bad at reading the Europeans, and they tend to overestimate the leverage that they have. That conversely opens space for Europeans to surprise them, and then occasionally to put their fist down on the table and to say, we're done with this. So I'm hoping that we can sort this out, but it's going to be hard.
Well, I think we've reached the top of the hour. and we definitely don't want to go too far over time, but I would like to thank you for coming back to us here in Texas, and you're always welcome here in Dallas and in Texas. And you know
Well,
that,
that would be lovely.
we love Washington just as much as you love Brussels. So we share a lot of the same dynamics, being federal, or in Europe's case, a more confederal system. But I want to thank you for your insights. We'll all look forward to those coming articles, especially the one you mentioned in Foreign Affairs. Bora, I'm going to turn it back over to you now to close the program.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you so much, Constanza. This was really wonderful, and thank you everyone for coming. And we hope to see you at future events and upcoming for the fall. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Thank you.
It was a real pleasure.
Thanks.
Perfect.
Glad to
Thank
be
you.
back, if only virtually.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.